This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only. Check out our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, at youtube.com/UCTV Prime. Subscribe today to get new programs every week.
So I want to start by talking about what it is that I'm going to be talking about tonight, and that's emotions and what they look like. And this is, so we're going to take a look together at this. And why don't you pretend that you're an anthropologist going to West Sumatra to study something that you've never seen before, and just look at this as if it were something unfolding for the first time. This is a fellow in our laboratory, and he's sitting across from a TV. This is what he's seeing. And he's going to see a film in which a worker cuts his hand. Very simple. And there's no audio for this. So let me get it started. He doesn't know what he's going to see. And that's what we study, that thing that he's doing. These little bursts of something that take 3 to 5 seconds apiece and go on over and over again in our lives and actually turn out to be a major ingredient in the course that our lives take and a hugely important factor in how we age. Most theorists of emotion think that the way this thing works that we just saw is that there's some sort of antecedent that sets off this chain of events. And in this case, it's a blood injury, which is a powerful thing that's built into our sort of genetic code. How many of you felt something when you saw that? How many of you found yourself involuntarily gasping or making an utterance? And how many of you made a face, do you think? Okay. So despite the fact that it was this black and white film, we didn't have any investment in this guy. You're sitting in a room full of strangers, and this thing just was thrown at you at the beginning of a talk. It powerfully activates something inside you that's set up to respond to this kind of injury. Now, there's an appraisal process that goes on inside you. Some of it might be conscious, but a lot of it in this case was probably automatic and unconscious. And we think that the theme that this probably sets off for us is one of decay and disease. And when we as humans see, if we were buzzards, and I know none of us are, and we saw decay and disease, we'd have a very different response. It would be like, yummy, it's dinner, right? But for us, it's really dangerous. And so that sets off an emotion, and it was the emotion that this fellow had, which is called disgust. And that emotion carries with it a sort of a computer program with a subroutine that activates the face, and in this case, a characteristic wrinkling of the nose. It activates for many people an utterance, and this, I couldn't spell what you did, but it's sort of the yuck sound. and a tendency to do something to kind of deal with this challenge. And of course, if you were a buzzard, you would approach it. But as a human, we want to get as far away from death and decay as possible. And then inside your body, a lot of things were probably starting to happen. So some of you, anybody actually feel the gag reflex in the back of your throat? Okay, well, I'll show you something more powerful later. Yeah. Promise me anything, but show me the gag reflex. You might have felt a little bit of salivation, maybe some of you a little bit of a butterfly in your stomach, that kind of activation of the gastrointestinal tract. Well, your body, even if it didn't produce it, it was getting ready to produce it. So if you had, for example, somehow got some of that foul stuff inside you, your body would have expelled it. Now, that's what an emotion looks like, and that's how we think it works. And then the next question is, there was one element in that that was totally missing, and that is, what does an emotion feel like? What does it feel like? And so in this talk, in the new improved version of this talk, there are, I think, 4 experiments we're going to do together. And this is the first one. And I actually want you to do them with me. And this is the easiest experiment. This is a thought experiment. So if you have a piece of paper handy, and I know you have my piece of paper, why don't you just take this test? Write down a couple of things that answer the question, what does disgust feel like? What's the experience of disgust like for you? What do you notice? Now, to finish the experiment, I want you to do something else. I want you to take your list, and I want you to cross out everything on your list that has anything that refers to something that's going on in your body or some feeling from your body. So if you said, for example, nausea, doesn't count. Got to take it off. And then the question to end this experiment is, what's left? Not much. The feeling of an emotion is really the sum of the information that's flowing from your body. And so if we take this model of emotion that we were talking about before, and we sort of complete it, and had I given you this talk a decade ago, it wouldn't have looked like this, because these are insights that come mostly from contemporary neuroscience and studies of the brain. But what probably happens is that all of this information in the sort of the orange circle gets passed below the line to a part of the brain that sort of processes information from the viscera and from movement, interoception and proprioception, and it creates a sense of feeling that goes with that disgusting emotion. So if you felt nausea, which is very physical, or repulsion, which is part of that withdrawal, that is that secondary part of this processing where your mind is actually reading out what's going on in your body and is creating an experience. Now, a decade ago, we were dominated by the idea that the body was subservient to the mind, and all the models of emotion went the other way. They started with conscious awareness, and then that generated the bodily response. Now it's been turned upside down. Now, one of the interesting things about subjective experience, when you sort of start to feel repulsed or something like that, is that becomes a sufficient antecedent to have more emotion. And so one of the things that happens for a lot of people, maybe not so much with that scene, but you start remembering other times when you felt that way. And it provides a bridge into your rich storehouse of emotional memories. Sometimes, though, we do kind of funny things where we kind of regulate that feeling. So you start to feel the gag reflex, and you kind of do something to push it down because it's very unpleasant. And one of the interesting things that humans do, and not many of you did, is you sometimes replace the emotion or deflect it with another one. So if I showed that that film to a group of college students at Berkeley, about a half of them would start giggling. So they would use laughter and humor and amusement as a way of converting that disgusting feeling into something more pleasant. And you know, if any of you have teenage children, or can remember when you had teenage children, they love to exercise these yucky emotions. They like to be afraid. They like to be disgusted. And they really enjoy it. And part of it is that process of converting that feeling into something else. As we get older, we don't do that as much. We sort of live inside the reality of our emotions. We sort of stay with them a little bit more. So that's the rest of the story. Now, there's a part of this that you might be thinking, I wonder, if this really does happen. Is there, just because I say I feel nausea, is anything really going on inside my body? And to answer that question, we have to look under the hood. And this is what we do a lot in our laboratory. I was very pleased. Every time I talk now, I've been here for long enough that often people have been in my laboratory, and it's a great honor and privilege to have a subject who's been in our experiments, and and he was a normal control, and one of the things you might remember is that we had all these stickers on you, and Wendy is one of the contemporary masters of the art of psychophysiology. And what we do is we actually monitor what's going on inside the body in real time when people are going through these psychological manipulations. And so this is the actual hood that we're looking under of this young man who was in a study that actually ran at UCSF when I first moved out here. And the first thing we're going to look at is his sweat gland activity. And this is time. And where the black line is, that was where the hand was cut. And you can see that before that, it was pretty calm in sweat gland land. And then once he was cut, there was this huge response. It happened almost immediately. And of course, that's part of what's going on underneath the hood, is these autonomic nervous system actions are being set off to prepare the person to deal with the situation or the challenge that the emotion is the solution to. Now, take a look at heart rate. This is how fast the heart is beating, and you'll see that it was also pretty calm. Heart rate doesn't, as you know, doesn't just stay still. It's always moving a little bit. But when the accident occurred, it shot up, just like skin conductance, and then it went through this kind of roller coaster for the time that we were watching on the video. Now, let's look not under the hood, but on the hood, and look at what was happening with the person's face. So that person that we were watching during the course of this emotion had 3 bursts of facial action. There were 3 facial expressions that occurred. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot them in real time on top of the rest of this physiology. And Wendy and I share two great loves in life. 1, psychophysiology, and 2, ballet. And this is the wonderful choreography of emotion. So these blue dots are the apexes of the 3 facial expressions that this fellow showed. And what you'll see is they just line up perfectly on the roller coaster of heart rate. The first one is at the gateway, when the emotion starts to occur, and the expression is perfectly in sync with the start of these other biological indicators. But then an interesting thing happens, and this is why the face is so interesting. The second one occurs at the very, very peak. And it's almost like an old, any of you ever have those pressure cookers with the little valves on the top? The face is kind of like that. It's sort of at the very height of emotion, it kind of fires, and it actually seems to release some of the emotional energy. And then the person calmed down a little bit and then went up for this expression, and once again, the heart rate and the facial expression occurred at the same time. So this beautiful, intricate choreography is going on inside of our bodies every time we have a powerful emotion. And it's really quite wonderful. And it's also a bit controversial, because most people would say that these things are not that well organized. But I think when you look within individual subjects who are powerfully in the throes of an emotion, you really see these nervous systems working together in this way. All right. So now this would be a very short talk and maybe that would make it a better talk if I just said, and nothing ever changes. So let's go home. But it turns out not to be the case. Now, one of the interesting things about psychology is emotion was pretty much on the back burner until Paul Ekman and Carol Izard started doing their seminal cross-cultural studies of facial expression. In fact, when I was in graduate school, we didn't have a class in emotion, and in a psychology textbook, there wasn't even a chapter in emotion. Now, if you look at the field of psychology, 95% of the papers are about emotion. It's just gone from nothing to everything. So most of what we studied in the early days of aging research wasn't emotion, but it was really cognition and physical functioning. And the story was not pretty. So if you look at what happens to our cognitive and physical abilities as we age, it's not a very pretty picture. Starting in the 30s and accelerating through middle age and on into late life, it really is a story of decline. Now, we know a little bit more now about the nuances of that, and it turns out that not everything goes down. So for example, vocabulary is something that actually does increase with age. It's, of course, not a great source of comfort as everything else is falling apart around us, but at least we have the language to describe everything that we're losing. So it wasn't surprising that the early theories of emotion pretty much assumed that emotions followed the same course. And in the 1950s and even through the 70s, around the time of this revolution in emotion research, the idea was that old age was a time of kind of declining emotion, and it was actually good for you because by turning off your emotions, you got ready for death. That was the theory. Those of you who heard Laura Carstenson's talk in this series, she actually turned the world around on this point. And she came up with a new view, and one of the things that Laura noticed was that most of the work that studied emotion in late life was conducted in nursing homes. And it's kind of like, it's kind of like studying physical functioning in the orthopedic ward. I mean, people are there for a good reason. And it turns out that, if you become demented or, seriously infirmed in late life, a lot of things change for the worse. But when Laura started studying emotional functioning in the community, in healthy elders, she and the people she influenced really found a different story. And so her model was more like this one, where emotional functioning really is sustained. So even though our bodies shut down and our minds become a little dulled by age, our emotions are built for the long haul, and they continue to serve an important role throughout our lives. And one of the reasons for that is it turns out that emotions, among their many important qualities, are the glue that enables us to form social relationships. And social relationships are a key part of successful aging. Not only relationships with your life partners, but with your children and with the people who you care for. And it turns out that there's a huge literature now that shows that social ties and social bonds are really associated with all sorts of positive health benefits in late life, and loneliness and isolation is associated with all sorts of problems. So there's something about the tuning of our emotional systems as we age that makes us capable of thriving or suffering as a function of the quality of our social bonds. And so Laura really just sort of figured this thing out, and someone who changed the way we think about this. Now, Laura had these kind of magnificent ideas, and then there's me, and we actually worked together for quite a while, and I kind of as you know, I like the little stuff. I like to go under the hood. So I wanted to see exactly what changed and in what way. And so I'm going to share with you some of our work, and we're going to do some of the experiments together to sort of show you that it turns out that even though by and large our emotions are sustained throughout life, there are some aspects that actually decline, and there's some, which is really interesting, that actually get better. And they're not the ones you think. So hence the title of our talk. So the first thing I have to say is there was a movie I remember when I was a kid or a song called Love is a Many Splendored Thing. Well, emotion is a many splendored thing. It is foolhardy to say that there's just one thing in emotion. There are lots of things. There are lots of processes. There are lots of things that our emotion system does. And in our work, we've really focused on 3 broad categories. And this turns out to be important because aging affects these in different ways. The first thing is the thing that we just looked at in that film, and that's just the simple emotional reactivity, responding to challenges and opportunities in the environment. You know, it's just having emotions, generating that physiological response and that behavioral adaptation. The second thing is emotion regulation. At least for humans, or at least once you get past being a teenager, we almost never just have an emotion. We almost always have to tinker with it. We can't just let it be. We have to sort of adjust it, you know, like, oh, I can't show you that I'm nervous, so I've got to appear to be very calm. You can't show me that you're bored, so you have to stifle that yawn. You know, you're trying to communicate that you're really interested in this, so you're going to magnify your head shaking to make me feel like you really are transfixed by this talk. We are just magicians when it comes to this regulating of our emotions, and we never leave well enough alone. And the third broad area that we're interested in is empathy, and that's really dealing with the emotions of other people. And it's a complicated area because one problem that we have to solve is we often want to know what other people are feeling. So, you know, is that person sad? Are they happy? But we also are capable of feeling what other people are feeling. Sometimes we actually another person's emotions become contagious and we become infected with them. And so some of you might actually have felt that person's disgust. And then we also have this helping feeling. So how many of you felt sorry for the fellow in that film? Okay. It's not a powerful stimulus, but later on I'm going to show you one that a lot of you will feel sorry. And so these are all things that we do, not with our own emotions, but with the emotions of others. So I'm going to go through these 3 broad domains with you and talk a little bit about how things change with age. And the first one is reactivity, and I'm just repeating the definition. It's responding to challenges and opportunities. And the story here is kind of an interesting one. We've studied all sorts of different aspects of emotional reactivity in people from their 20s to their 90s. We've startled them with loud noises. You remember that from my lab. We do that all the time. We've had them retrieve emotional memories. We show them films like in the thing you just saw. And I'll show you an example of this later on. But we have people interact with an intimate partner. And that's a very powerful producer of emotion. And if I sort of were to sum up hundreds and hundreds of individuals who we've worked with in dozens of studies, there isn't a lot that changes between 20 and 90 in your capacity to respond emotionally to things that happen in the outside world and in your inner life. As long as you're healthy and your brain is not damaged or injured, you will continue to have powerful emotions about the same level as you've had all your life for decades to come. So if you like your emotions, it's good news. If you think they're too big and powerful, sorry. If your friends think they're too weak, and it's not going to. They may not improve. This seems to be set fairly early on and doesn't change. But even within that generalization, there are some interesting nuances. And the one that we've gotten interested in is the emotion of sadness, which and in a recent recent paper, we summarized several studies that we've done. Sadness is kind of an interesting emotion because some people think that older people are very depressed, but there's no data that suggests that. Rates of depression are actually lower in late life than at other periods. But sadness is not the same as depression. So what we did is we did a study where we showed people in their 20s, 40s, and 60s, 2 sad films and 2 disgusting films. And we looked at how much sadness they reported experiencing. And as you can see, with age, people reported watching the same film, feeling more and more sadness. And we looked at their physiological responses. And when I show you physiology, when things go up, that's bigger. So this is a sort of an average of a lot of physiological measures, and they get larger and larger with age. This was a finding that was specific to sad films. It wasn't that older people had bigger emotions when they saw the disgusting films. And as I said before, it isn't the same thing as depression. It's just the capacity that when you see someone who's experiencing loss, that you have an emotional response. And so it seems that even though most emotions stay about the same, as we age, our capacity to experience sadness gets turned up a little bit. Now, that was the first interesting discovery. Now, the second question was, is it good for you or bad for you to have that kind of turned up the volume for your sadness? And this is our second experiment. This comes from a study. And we're going to do a little test. Our inspiration was the ink blot test, or the Rorschach test, where the idea is that there's nothing here really, it's just an ink blot. But when you look at it, you see things in it, and they really come out of you, not out of the blot. So the way to find out about you is to see what you see. So for example, how many of you see the bat? That's very popular. How many of you see the dancing women in the middle? Of course, yeah. And so I'm sure all the dancers see that, and all the Batman fans see the bat. So we went about this in a different way. We did a lot of research, and we found what we believe is the most boring film in the world. It's like that commercial, The Most Interesting Man. This is the most boring film in the world. And so I'm going to ask you to do this experiment with us. And we're going to watch the film together. And then I'm going to ask you some questions, okay? Okay, that's enough. So now, in our study, go ahead and do this if you don't mind. Fill out this questionnaire. How much of each of those 4 emotions did you feel when you were watching the film? Using a 0 to 8 scale, where 0 is no emotion and 8's the most of that emotion you've ever felt, the most powerful version. And why don't you do it for anger, fear, disgust, and sadness? Just assign a number to it. And since some of you laughed, why don't we put amusement or happiness as a fifth choice? How many of you felt something? How many of you, okay. Which is kind of interesting, right? Because, there was not much going on. And the idea, of course, is that where that came from is, in part, you. Because there was hardly anything there, and you brought something to the table. And our idea is that thing that you bring is sort of your personal emotional bias. It's like each of us has a palette of emotion, and you, in these neutral situations, paint with the one that you're sort of biased toward. So how many of you experienced anger, the most powerful of the 5 emotions that we rated? Good. How many of you experienced fear as the most powerful? Okay. How many of you disgust? And how many sadness? Okay. Take a look at, keep your hands up to sad people, because that's interesting. And look around the room and see what the people look like who experience sad. because they are the chosen. So the results, which it hasn't come out, but it should be coming out in the next month or so, were as following: that for older subjects, these were people in their 60s, the more sadness that you reported watching this neutral, boring film, the happier you were in your life. And for people in their 40s, the more anger that they reported, the happier they were in their life. And for young people, it made no difference. And it raises this interesting question about, we know that older people in general have this bias towards sadness, and the more of it that they show in these neutral situations, the better they're doing in life. And it really asks this interesting question: why might sadness be a useful emotion for for aging successfully? And I think you can think about the meaning of late life. This becomes total speculation, but Erik Erikson was this great lifespan developmentalist who was at Berkeley at the Institute for Human Development for part of his career, and he wrote about generativity as being the primary goal of late life. And I think you can add to that caregiving and things like grandparenting and things like compassion. And it seems like that capacity to respond with sadness to the needs and suffering of others is a really important part of what makes late life meaningful. Now that's a little bit soupy, and I promised Wendy I wouldn't be totally soupy. Let's turn it now into a more calculating idea, and that is that older people who are capable of sadness may be better able to make social bonds because they respond to people in need, they make those kind of connections, and those kinds of connections pay huge benefits for their own well-being. In middle age, it might be that anger is the useful bias to have because you really want to get in there and fight for what you're building your career, you're building your family, you're defending your turf, your reputation. And so a little bit of bias in the direction of being a fighter might be more useful, not so useful in late life. And then in youth, that probably doesn't make any difference. There's so many things that are not fully formed. But it's an interesting idea that, that in late life, having sadness, the capacity for sadness, is good for you, and it doesn't seem to convert into higher rates of depression. So that's the first sort of surprising finding. Now I'm going to turn now to emotion regulation, which is the second broad domain of emotional functioning. And we talked about this as tweaking your emotions. And it turns out there's some really interesting age differences here too. And you get to do another experiment. And you get to see something more revolting than the first one. All right. So this is the emotion regulation and aging experiment that we did. Came out a couple of years ago. And for this one, I'm going to divide the room up into 4 quadrants. And you're going to see a film. It's an episode of Fear Factor, which, by the way, is misnamed. It's not about fear. It's about disgust. And if you're all the way over in the left, your instructions are to just watch the film, okay? If you're sort of in the next quarter, your instructions are, if you have any feelings as you're watching it, don't let it show. So really focus on shutting down the behavioral signs of the emotion. If you're in this quarter, when you watch the film, try to adopt a detached and unemotional attitude. As you watch the film clip, try to think about what you're seeing in an objective way. So you're also trying to regulate your emotion, but you're doing it through this mental operation. And then over here, we like to call this the happy quarter. When you watch the film, please try to think about the positive aspects of what you're seeing. All right? So you got your task. So these were the 4 conditions in the study, and we showed people sad films and we showed them disgusting films. Now I'm going to show you the film. I have to tell you, it is a little gross, and if you want to look away, just make that a 5th condition. But But try to be, again, if you want to experience what this is like, try to do the instruction, and then we'll talk about what it felt like. We showed this to people in their 40s, 60s, and 20s, and we then measured under the hood to see how large their bodily response was, and also asked them to tell us how much emotion they experienced. And one of my graduate students is currently coding all their facial expressions to see how that turned out. And what we found was something kind of interesting. So here are our 4 conditions again. And what we are going to focus on is these 3 conditions, because those are the regulation, and it turns out that with age, there's a different trajectory of improvement or inability to control your emotions in this way. So the first thing is this suppression. That was the group over there that just tried to keep their face from firing. Turns out that young, middle-aged, and old, we've now replicated this in 2 studies, you never get any better or any worse. So if you were a good poker player when you were a kid, you're probably going to be a good poker player when you're older, because your ability to sort of control that expression stays about the same. Now, here's something that actually changes with age, and it changes in a way where you get worse at it. And this is consistent, I think, with a lot of what we know about the aging brain. It's very hard to detach as you age. It gets harder and harder. It's harder to sort of not get engaged by things. That capacity, we call it executive function. It's associated with frontal cortex, to be able to take your attention and kind of lift it away from something that has it and put it somewhere else. That becomes harder and harder in general to do as you get older. And in the emotional realm, it's really an area that older people just aren't very good at doing that strategy. So in our experiment, when older people were told to do that, they weren't very successful. However, over in the happy side, this is something that people actually get much better at with age. The ability to take that kind of horrible sea of horse rectum and find something positive in it and to sort of focus on that. That turns out to be something that you get markedly better at as you get older. And I'm sure Laura talked about this in her talk. She's talked about the positivity bias. In a lot of areas of adult development, there's a kind of a biasing towards positive over negative. So Laura's done interesting work showing that as we age, we tend to remember positive information better than negative. In fact, a lot of the age deficits in memory go away when you have things that are more positive. So in this realm of emotion regulation, this is a strategy that actually, we don't exactly know what, but I think it is the aging brain makes it harder for you to detach from things, but easier to focus on these more positive things. So it's a really good strategy to use as you get older to deal with things that in your emotional life where you really want to get control of your emotions. So this was a real interesting finding for us, and it suggested that as you look under these specific aspects of emotional functioning, this pattern gets very interesting and in interesting ways. Is it good to be an emotion regulator? We already know that it's good to be sad as you age, and this is a pretty unqualified yes. This is a study I did with a visiting scholar from the Rotman Institute in Toronto, and he's in a business school. And we looked at the ability to increase and decrease emotional response to films in 2 large samples of adults. And good regulators, people who were successful at manipulating their emotions, reported greater well-being and higher incomes in both studies. So if you can master this skill, you're going to have not only a happy life, but you're going to make lots of money. And I know it's kind of silly, but this is the reference. But in a way, it makes sense, because a lot of what we have to do in life, in these complex social situations, is get our emotions under control. And And instead of being victimized by them, use them effectively. And there are all sorts of errors you can make, emotional errors, that can interfere with your career and interfere with your relationships and interfere with your dealing with your children and on and on and on. And the people who become the sort of the master emotion regulators, the kind of the gymnasts in the emotional realm, they just do better in life. So practice. Now, the other domain that we've studied is empathy. And again, it's an interesting story and a complicated one, but one I think that makes sense. So I'm going to start with something that we really get worse at with age. And it's this task. So if I ask you, what is she feeling? And those are your choices. Anger? How many just raise your hands? Fear? Sadness? That's the right answer. Disgust, happy, and surprise. Okay, it turns out that this was a huge meta-analysis that was conducted of about 30 or 40 studies of this. It's very clear that as we age, we just get worse at taking these photographs of faces and telling what people are feeling. Now, I must say, having done some of these studies, I don't think that people adequately control for changes in vision in these studies, and that may account for some of it. But I also think that it's a very unnatural task. Now, as unnatural as that is, this one's even worse, and this is used a lot. You just show people the eyes, and now you say, what's that person feeling? Hateful? Arrogant? Jealous? Panicked. Oh, you got so much better. Yeah, that's just a practice item. You're going to do worse with that as you age. Fortunately, except if you're like looking through your high school yearbook, you'll probably never use this ability. So we got interested in whether or not there would be the same kinds of deficits when people were doing more ecologically valid emotion reading tasks. And we have, as Wendy mentioned, John Gottman and I, starting in the 1970s, and in our lab, continuing now. I don't think any of you have been in this study, but we've had a 20-year longitudinal study of Bay Area marriages, Bay Area first marriages. But we like to affectionately call them the successful dinosaurs. They're, the last generation that stayed, only married once, and in our older group, the average couple has been married now over 55 years. And we've been studying this group for 2 decades, and we just are applying for a grant to continue that. And it's turning out to be a very interesting study. But one of the things that we've used from that is we've looked at people's ability to read out emotion in these real-life interactions. Most of the times when you read out emotions for other people, they're engaged in a social situation, and you're not just saying sad. You're tracking how their emotions change over time. So it's time for another experiment. And this time I'm going to show you, and this is the research we did, I'm going to show you an interaction of one of our couples who's been in our study for 20 years. And they're talking about a problem in their relationship. It was a decision that they made to have children, which the wife felt really kind of ruined a lot of the opportunities she would have had in life. And it's very real. It's an unrehearsed conversation. They're going to be looking out at you because we have 2 cameras. When they look out at you, they're actually looking right at each other. And they're going to be, what we're going to do is, if you'll take your little handout, I'd like you to focus on the husband and sort of indicate from moment to moment how negative, neutral, or positive he feels. So if when it starts you feel like he's very negative, you'd kind of draw the line down here. This down at the bottom is the time. We're going to watch about a minute of the interaction. And so you're going to end up kind of drawing a line, a squiggly line, that indicates how his emotions are changing during this interaction. Now, we thought that this was the real thing. This was as close as you could get to the kind of reading of emotions that we really have to do in real life. It'd be nice if you could stop it and look at a photograph, but this is what real life looks like. So it's kind of fast and furious. All right, here we go.
So you say, go ahead, you start. You say you would have been better, you would have better off if I backed you for not having children?
If you
And backed you for not having children?
did that to me, so that think about what a marriage would have had.
I don't know. I say yes.
You're just saying that.
No, I don't think so.
It's such an insult to me, Tom,
Hold on, listen.
to reduce me to such a level. I wanted so much to share a life with you. Instead of sharing life, I ended up in trash.
No, wait a minute, hold on. I will admit, you're perfectly right. Having kids may be miserable for a woman, that's perfectly true. It may well be tough on a woman in terms of losing 8 years of professional life and being, locked in the home and all that, okay?
Yeah.
But I don't think it's that simple. For one thing, I think that there's a lot more biologically that you're
Look
ignoring.
at all the wonderful marriages that have been childless.
Who?
One there was a fantastic childless marriage. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor.
Okay, so that's real life, as close as we can get in the laboratory. And it's hard, isn't it? Because you got to focus on him and not sort of see what she's doing. And it changes, and there's subtleties. And is a laugh a happy moment, or is it really an angry laugh? But those are the kinds of computations that your social brain is doing all the time. And so what I'm going to show you now is, this is his squiggly line. And see how close you came to it. Well, if you look at, as I said before, if you look at being able to work with these photographs, it's the province of the young. The older do not do well. But when you switch to this task that we just did, it flip-flops. And this is actually something it's quite a dramatic finding. Even though you have to do this hand-eye stuff, and even though you have to kind of do a lot of filtering, people get better at this, at matching these squiggly lines with age. And it's a nice linear effect. And so, we think that kind of social emotional intelligence that, goes with this kind of more life experience, more experience with other people's emotions, and this greater attunement really serves you well. And I think it's one of the reasons that a lot of people find older people to be very attuned. A number of years ago, Rachel Ebling and I did an interesting study, or at least I thought it was an interesting study, where we had people look at these same kind of tapes, and then we sort of asked them a question, and that is, how happily married are those people? Were any of you in that study? And we did that a long time ago. And we looked at, by age and profession, who could look at 3 minutes of a couple and tell whether they were happily married or not. So first let me tell you who was terrible at it. The worst people, bar one, were marital therapists. They could not do that. The only people who were worse than marital therapists were marital researchers. There was only one personal characteristic that predicted ability to do this, and it was age. The older you were, the better you were at looking at 3 minutes of complex social behavior. And in this study, you looked at 10 different couples, so it's a pretty good test. And older people were the ones who could do this. So it does seem to be a domain where our emotion systems really do grow and improve with age. All right, and let me talk about one more area where it's clear that older people show growth and development, and that is this kind of emotional empathy, or feeling other people's pain and engaging in helping behavior. And this was a study that we just did recently, again in the Bay Area, 3 age groups. They saw 2 films, and the one to focus on is this genocide film. And then at the end of the film, I'm going to show you a little bit of it, we gave people an extra $10 they weren't expecting. And we said, you can keep it, or you can give it to a charity that actually helps the people in the film. And these were real charities, and we actually contributed the money. And so people could keep all 10, or they could give most of it to one film or the other. And we controlled for income and all of the things that might confound. So we actually had a sort of a measure of how much people gave. So I'm going to show you what the film looks like, just a little bit, and see what you feel as you're watching it. All right. How many of you felt something? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And how many of you felt? It's interesting. How many of you felt sadness? And how many of you felt something a little different? Did you feel like? How many of you felt that sort of urge to want to, sort of a compassionate feeling where you want to do something? So it's an interesting mixed emotion. So if we look at how much distress people felt inside when they watched, and again, this is after all the statistical controls for everything like social desirability, personality, and it's pretty much a pure measure of what was going on in people. The older you are, the more distressed you feel inside as you watch these kinds of scenes. And also, the bigger your physiological response was to them, and the more you gave. And interestingly, one of the things that we found was that the bigger your physiological response was, also the more you gave. So again, this tendency to have a large emotional response and then probably to feel that the stress that came from it may have contributed some to this wanting to do something to help people. But it's clearly another story where this responding to the pain of others and doing something about it, both of which increase linearly with age. Very different than the original story. Okay, and is empathy good for you? Is that kind of empathy good for you? I don't know the answer. We haven't done that work yet. But I think it's complicated. We know that when people have very little empathy, it can lead to cruel and insensitive behavior, and it undermines close relationships. But it's also probably the case that if you have too much empathy, that you take on everyone else's pain and distress, their sadness and their rage, that's probably not very good for your health either. So empathy may be one of these things where there's a happy medium that we're all sort of seeking, and it's somewhere in between. As you age, though, you get biased towards having larger empathic responses in this domain. So it's something to think about. All right, so I'm going to kind of summarize now and have a few thoughts, and then see if you have any questions. And so I think the first thing we can dispense with is the idea that emotion with age looks like these other things. It certainly looks more like the pattern that Laura envisioned and the people that she influenced. But not every cognitive ability follows this pattern. Certainly in the emotional realm, there's some things that go up a little bit, there's some things that follow this pattern, and some things that go down. And of course, the job of science, I think, is to figure out what these things are and whether they make any difference. So we've found a lot of things that differ as a function of age, and a number of them that turn out to have a lot of implications for people's well-being and health and how well they're doing in life. Well, let me summarize. This is just all the data that we found that I presented, and then I'm going to say something about what I think it all means. So in normal aging, in the realm of emotional reactivity, our responses to challenge and opportunities, in general, there's not much that changes with age. But sadness does tend to go up, and it appears the more it goes up, the better it is for you. In the realm of regulation, we maintain our ability to shut down behavioral displays. We get worse at detaching from emotional things. I think that's also kind of why those images of genocide are so powerful. And we become better at finding the positive piece of things, focusing on that, and using that as a way of regulating our negative emotions. In the realm of empathy, we get worse at being able to process these static visual images, but our ability to track dynamic, socially embedded emotion gets better with age. Seems like the more complex it is socially, the better we do with age. And our response to the suffering of others, both in terms of our internal responses and our likelihood of taking action to be helpful, also seem to increase with age. So what does this all mean for successful aging? I think that each of us ages with a kind of unique set of ingredients. Our brains weaken and remain strong in different ways. We have, in our work last decade, with Bruce Miller's group here at UCSF, we've become very interested in dementia. And some of the dementias affect your cognitive abilities and some of your emotional abilities. But even in normal aging, there's some of us who, how many of you have trouble with word finding? Okay, we all have trouble with that, but not everybody the same way. How many of you have trouble with old memories? A lot of people, that's preserved. There's a kind of a unique set of changes in your brains that is influencing what you're good at and what's more difficult as you age. Our life experiences provide us with perspective, or can provide us with perspective, generosity, caring, and sometimes even wisdom. But then some of us live lives that are difficult and challenging and cold and rejecting, and we come into old age with selfishness and narrowness and folly. Our intimate relationships clearly shape our lives, our parents, our partners, our friends, hopefully helping us get better at the fine art of relating to others and enabling us to invest more in and derive greater benefits from social relationships. Certainly there's great potential here with age, but I don't think everybody lives the kind of life and has the kind of social relationships that enable them to realize these. And our emotions, as I've said in this talk, in some aspects weaken, some remain strong, some improve, and then there are differences among us. In the end, I think emotion is the straw that stirs the drink. And it really is that one thing that kind of mixes these ingredients from biology, experience, and our social lives, and sort of creates this recipe that we're all trying to follow to age successfully. So, thank you very much.